All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland and our guest, Steve Ward. Steve, do we have you there with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thanks for coming on the show. I'm pretty excited about this. I hear you got some coming up here with Mac Maloney. We had him on not too long ago, and that was a lot of fun. Mac's
a blast.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Okay, so, this is I was telling Kara before the break here that from folklore to flying saucers, the connections, there's something that I've really been interested in because I feel like these ancient aliens, they're throwing out all these connections and stuff, but I feel like there are so many just sort of weird little tales that catch on and hold on and are reiterated throughout history that there has to be some kind of connection going on there.
Well, of course, Jaques Vallee. Now, Jaques Vallee was he is a computer scientist and mathematician. He came over from France in the 1960s, and he became a colleague of Dr. J. Allen Hynek. And, of course, Hynek was attached to Project Blue Book back in the old days, and they've made this, recent television show where they've kind of reimagined reality and history, but that's another story. But they became colleagues, and Jaques Vallee approached the UFO problem from a very scientific standpoint initially. And his first two books, including Challenge to Science, Challenge to Science dealt with a wave of landings in France in about the early mid-50s. And what they were a series of, sort of egg-shaped silver craft. The entities that got out were usually kind of small, wearing kind of silver coveralls and so forth. Anyway, by the way, this is before the Greys kind of came in, much later. That's another thing we can talk about. But because back in those days, we used to have quite a variety of aliens or entities that people were reporting with these close encounters. Well, his third book was called Passport to Magonia. And it was like so many of these researchers, he kind of threw his hands up and said, look, he even writes in it, he says, this is not a scientific book. But he started to see that there were many interesting patterns between various traditions and folklore and some modern-day UFO experiences.
Yeah, so this is where you're picking up from. I'm sorry, I really kind of want to hop right into the meat there, but I don't mean to cut you off.
Okay, I just wanted to give a dramatic pause in case you wanted to respond.
Yeah.
So he quotes heavily in Passport to Magonia is a fascinating book, but anything by Vallee is really excellent. He's written a series of his journals, these giant volumes that covered the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So you can't go wrong by getting into Vallee's works. But in Passport to Magonia, he quotes heavily from a gentleman named Walter Evans Wentz. Now, he wrote a book in 1911 called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. And he went around interviewing people in Ireland about their experiences with the fairies, the little people, the elementals. And now, when we talk about fairies, we're not talking about these benign little Tinkerbells that did good deeds for people. The fairies were kind of feared, and they could be beneficial, but they could have a negative side. And they even, one of the names for them they had was the good people, because they did not want to accidentally incur their wrath. Well, Wentz went around interviewing people the same way we do nowadays when we talk to people about their UFO sighting or seeing a Bigfoot or whatever. So these were one-on-one encounters and in real time. These weren't just stories handed down from a great uncle. So, and some of the patterns, some of the parallels that he found were, well, of course, in modern day UFO experiences, we're very familiar with the concept of missing time. Well, that same element happened with encounters with the fairies. If you were taken by the fairies or if you encountered them, sometimes you would experience this time distortion. You thought you were just maybe spending a few minutes or a few hours with them, but a whole day might pass. But now usually instead of being whisked away to an unscheduled medical examination aboard some kind of a craft, right. You might be taken to what they thought was inside a mountain or perhaps in the underground kingdom of the fairies. Of course, some abductees believe they were taken to an underground facility run by the aliens. But there are several other things, like in both cases you might encounter perilous. Both the UFO entities sometimes and the fairies would carry something like a tube or a wand, and you would find yourself unable to move. You could be what they call pixie-led, where there would be something, you would have some kind of urging, or something would guide you to a particular clearing or part of the forest, and then the fairies would take you. But that's fairly common in much of the UFO literature, where people, there was a case in, I think, British Columbia, where two women just got this urge to stop the car and go stargazing. Well, standing right there when they got out were a couple of grays. So this is there's several other things too, but there are many parallels between the two. And
yeah,
even,
it's interesting because, of course, how would they explain technology that they had never even seen before? I mean, we're looking at Dark Age technology, and that is really interesting. Those are the parallels that I've been trying to think of, because it's like they make these parallels to way back in human history and antiquity. There's nothing written down, and it's like this is definitely striking a nerve with me as being plausible.
Well, it's interesting because there are some cases. There was a series of landings and encounters, at this time with what you might call giants as opposed to the fairies. But some of the little people were seen there too. 1977 in Dyfed, Wales, F.W. Holliday and Randall Pugh wrote a book called The Dyfed Enigma, and they talked about a lot of parallels between folklore and modern-day UFO experiences, such as people were seeing these 7-foot-tall humanoids. And in their context, they would say, well, they look kind of like they were wearing boiler suits, but only these particular entities had arms that were kind of elongated. They were quite agile. They could jump over fences. And oftentimes they would spook people by peering in their window, which was rather high up off the ground.
That's terrifying.
People that had...
we were just commenting that that's absolutely terrifying.
Right, that's a horror movie staple right there.
Yeah.
It's impressive.
It's a fascinating book, and there's several other books written about that time period, but some of the people that were in close proximity with these entities developed some kind of a weird dermatological condition, some kind of a skin rash. Well, there used to be something called elf sickness or elf burn, which was also some kind of a dermatological condition. Now, of course, there's no way we could ever say definitively that it's the same thing. But there's one particular case. I don't know if you've heard of Joe Symington and the pancakes.
No, I haven't.
What I like to call the cosmic pancakes from outer space.
No.
Well, this took place in Eagle River, Wisconsin. This is a case that will bring everything together. This is 1961, April, Eagle River, Wisconsin. Joe is a plumber by trade and a chicken farmer by day. He's out on his farm. He says he hears, and by the way, you can hear him tell his story on some of the old YouTube footage. But he says he hears this god-awful noise like knobby tires on a pavement. He looks out, and he sees this classic sort of flying saucer hovering just off the ground on his property, and the door is open. Now, he approaches this thing. He's not afraid because, while it's a very strange situation, there's nothing threatening there. And he can see people inside that, as he gets closer, they look like they're probably about 5 feet tall, wearing some kind of coveralls and some kind of a skull cap. And one of them leans out and hands him a bowl or a chalice or something like that. Looks like it's made of chrome, the same material as the craft. And he indicates through sign language that he wants water in it. Now, Joe's looking around in there, and he sees there's some kind of controls in there and so forth. But this is where it gets really weird. He looks behind him, and he sees what looks like another guy cooking something on a flameless grill. Now, the thing is, so Joe dutifully goes and gets water from his well. The thing is that when, Dr. J. Allen Hynek actually investigated this along with the Air Force back when he was still attached to Blue Book, there was a local judge there that knew Joe. Everybody believes that Joe didn't make this up. That Joe really believes this happened to him. And that the thing is, if you look at some of the patterns here, they're very interesting. Now, the Air Force, while they did not believe this really happened, decided to spend our taxpayers' money and examine the contents of the pancakes. Now, here's a couple other things I want to get to before I get to that.
Well, unfortunately,
go ahead.
We're coming up on a hard break here.
Okay.
And
all right.
So we're going to come back to this story. Both Kara and I are very enthralled. I want to know where we're going with this pancake thing.
Well, we're going to go. We're going to talk about what these gentlemen looked like.
Awesome. I'm sorry to have to cut it off. You're listening to Steve Ward here on Radio Wasteland. Come on back.
And don't forget to follow Radio Wasteland on Facebook at facebook.com/radiowasteland.us.
All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland and our guest, Steve Ward. Steve, before we were so rudely interrupted by our commercial break, you were telling us about the guy Joe. There was this ship that landed in his yard, at the edge of his yard. He went out there. The guy was motioning him for him to get some water. He saw somebody behind him cooking on what appeared to be a flameless stove. He went to get the water, and now he's coming back with the water. That's about where we left off.
Right. So he gives them the water, and in return they give him what looks like 3 pancakes. And he takes the pancakes, which he says they taste terrible. And these are the pancakes that the Air Force decided to spend taxpayers' money on, even though they didn't believe any of it, and see what the contents were. But we'll get to that in a moment. We were talking about how the local judge, Judge Carter, who knew Joe, believed that Joe really had an experience, or believed he did. But so he interviewed him. And he said, now his first question was a little bit tongue-in-cheek. He says, Joe, what do these guys look like, little green men? And Joe says, no, Judge, they're kind of swarthy looking, like Italians. So John Keel in Operation Trojan Horse. Now, Keel is the one that wrote the Mothman Prophecies. He's sort of I call him the mentor I never knew. When I read UFOs Operation Trojan Horse, it really completely changed my paradigm of the whole UFO field. He tended to find patterns and with seemingly disparate types of paranormal activity. But at any rate, Keel found this old press conference from General Spaatz. Now, he's one of the big generals of World War II. And in part of this press conference, he says, there's no truth to the rumor that Spaniards are driving flying saucers or that they're coming from Spain. Okay, now, I don't think Italy and Spain had a secret space program, but I could be wrong.
Right.
Now,
or that they're particularly all that swarthy, you know.
That's right, exactly. Well, this is Joe. Joe's a little bit has some rough edges. Okay,
right.
So now Keel also, and again, this is before the Greys that we think of as the classic aliens didn't really start showing up en masse until like the late 70s, early 80s with the movie Close Encounters and Whitley Strieber's books. You could find a Grey occasionally, but you're finding all kinds of other variety of alleged entities that came out of these craft. Keel was documenting several people that would that they said they saw people that were very humanoid, and they weren't terribly sophisticated in their descriptions either. They would say, well, they looked kind of European or dark foreign types. The infamous injured cold that Woodrow Derenberger is supposed to have contacted during the whole Mothman fiasco fits that description to a T. And even some of when you get into another can of worms, the Men in Black phenomena, some of those characters kind of follow the same pattern. So what does this really mean? I'm not sure. But let's find out what was in the pancakes, what the Food and Drug Administration found out. Now we have to segue again to Evans Wentz, the gentleman who documented all these, one-on-one encounters with the fairies in just like 100 years ago.
Right.
He was told by an Irishman. He said the fairies eat fresh meat. They drink fresh water, just like the water that Joe served them, but they never take salt. Guess what was the missing ingredient in the cosmic pancakes from outer space?
No salt.
There was no sodium.
And that's why they tasted terrible?
Well, possibly, but it's if you find out the right YouTube thing, you'll find out that Joe said he would have never taken a ride with these guys because their food tasted so bad. Now, let's just step back a moment and look at the absurdity of this. Perhaps, I don't know if this is a real event or not, but in a lot of elements of the paranormal don't make sense. I mean, if this is some kind of a space pod from the mothership, what the heck is going on with their plumbing that they need an external source of water?
Right.
Why do they cook food and waste all that space on a grill when they could develop freeze-dried food?
Right.
And remember, the astronauts used to have Tang in a little bag, right? So then the other thing is, in modern day, we tend to think, again, if this is a real event, we tend to think, well, it's kind of strange, but it's got to be E.T. But 100 or 200 years ago, they would have said Joe had an encounter with the fairies. And even though they arrived in a strange metal chariot, and you were always warned about eating the food from fairyland, because if you did, sometimes you wouldn't be able to get back. But there's other threads you can follow. There's another case where some miners in California in the mid-'50s saw a little entity kind of dressed a little bit like a leprechaun. He's got some kind of a tweed-like cloth coat on with buckles. This little guy grabs a bucket of water and takes it up into his craft. Now, these guys, I guarantee you that John Black and John Van Allen, these two miners, never met Joe Symington, and vice versa.
Right.
So that's just some of the strange patterns and parallels. There's other things we can talk about too. If you go back into Elias Owen, and he wrote a book called On Welsh Folklore, and he talked about how the wayfarers at night, the men along the road, would be afraid to encounter a mist because they might be taken by the fairies and lifted up in the air, and then for a little mischief, the fairies would deposit them someplace far from home and just leave them to find their way back. Well, let's look at a case in England, 1980. Alan Godfrey in Todd Morton, England. He's a police officer. He's out looking for some displaced cattle, and that's actually another interesting thread we can follow if we have time. But he's driving along the road. He sees this strange swirling craft, and all of a sudden, he's a little further down the road, almost as if the fairies or the elementals had lifted him up and set him down the road a little further. Well, later on, he finds out that he's missing time. So a few months go by, and he's able to set up with a therapist to try and recapture these memories. So during the session, now he is destined for one of these unscheduled medical examinations with no deductible and no copay. Right. But before that, he's describing what's going on. He's under hypnosis. He's describing what's going on in the craft, and there's a pause, and he says, "There's a bloody dog in here." There was a large black dog that he described about the size of a German Shepherd. And the interesting thing there is, if you know the folklore of the British Isles, it sounds like, perhaps, the black shuck, that the black spectral dog that shows up in old castle ruins and along the moors. There's and even here in the U.S., there's a tradition of the black dog, sometimes in association with UFO activity and so forth. So, and there's even other things. When he described the entities on board the craft, basically humanoid, but there was one very tall and the other ones were short. That happens in some of the cases with the grays. There's a tall gray and the other ones are short. I interviewed a lady named Missy Lamontagne who had an abduction experience. And she was in a situation where there were these pale grays on one side and there was this tall, almost angelic entity on her right side. Kind of a female presence, sounding something very similar to what Whitley Strieber described. And if you go back into folklore, it was very common to have the tall fairy or the fairy queen sort of in control of the smaller ones or the lesser ones. So it gets pretty crazy when you follow this path. And it can't be definitive. You can't say, well, look, these are absolutely connected. But it is fascinating when you start looking at these different parallels and connections.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look back and you say, okay, well, there must be something more to myth, and then you also say, I don't believe in magical powers, I believe in science. This is not necessarily a far leap from one to the next in order to get there. We have been totally just enthralled with these stories. This is nothing that I've ever heard before, but totally fits into kind of the questions I've been asking myself about more recent history with these mythological comparisons that people have made.
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about this topic before. I'm given to understand that there's folklore too about fairies in the past, riding around in craft that was considered strange by the standards of the time, ships and chariots and so forth.
Well, let's not chase it too far. We're about to go into another commercial break here. You're listening to Steve Ward. We're talking about From Folklore to Flying Saucers, Unexpected Connections in the Paranormal. You're listening to Radio Wasteland, so come on back.
Find all our shows and archives by visiting Radio Wasteland at radiowasteland.us.
All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland and our guest Steve Ward. We're talking about From Folklore to Flying Saucers, Unexpected Connections in the Paranormal. So I guess you got some speaking engagements coming up, Toledo Paranormal and Bigfoot Conference, and you have your own regular podcast. Well, let's talk about the Paranormal and Bigfoot Conference first. I assume this is the topic that you're currently discussing, right?
I'm going to go through a whole array of things. I'll be covering a lot of cryptid stuff too, like the idea that the Loch Ness Monster may not be actually a physical creature, but maybe something more like a psychic projection. And one of the reasons there is that F.W. Holliday, who investigated the Loch Ness Monster back in the 70s, found that many other people were seeing these type of creatures all over the place in lakes in Ireland and Scotland, but many of these lakes were so small, there wasn't a big enough fish population to even feed one of these creatures, much less a colony. There's a lot of other things. That Loch Ness turns out to be a UFO hotspot, and a lot of things to consider there. And also Bigfoot. There is some suggestion that Bigfoot may have some kind of paranormal overtones as well. But yeah, it's going to be in Toledo, Ohio. The Toledo Bigfoot and Paranormal Conference. Ken Gerhardt's going to be there, who's a very well-known cryptozoologist, and Chitan Noir and Donald Allison. So it's only about $10, so it'd be a fun day to come out and then check it out. And I have a podcast called The High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK Radio Network every 2 weeks, or as they say, across the pond, every fortnight.
All right. Yeah, the High Strangeness Factor is the factor that I really like a lot in a lot of these things. That the stuff that really just kind of blows your mind. Like you were saying with Loch Ness, I've heard this once, and I've tried to bring it up with people a couple of times, and a lot of the time they haven't heard it, but I'm going to guess that you've heard it. And that is that the sides in the stone in Loch Ness, there's something like quartz that they're saying might possibly be creating a situation through vibrations that's actually opening a time portal, which is why we can't find Nessie, that it's actually passing in and out of whatever prehistoric era the plesiosaur is from, and then coming back in search of food.
It's just that it likely isn't a plesiosaur. Plesiosaurs were air-breathing, and even if they survived into the present day, it may be something else. And Holliday early on thought it was a flesh-and-blood creature, but from the descriptions, he thought it was something more like an oversized mollusk. And his candidate was something called a Telemonstrum gregarium, which has been extinct for about 3 million years and only got to be about 3 feet long. But the idea was that it was something. In fact, he chronicles some incredible sightings of this thing crossing the road. I mean, this thing was on land, and the people that saw it said it didn't have legs. It was slithering more like a giant slug. Yeah. So I got to I got to Loch Ness back in 1973 when I backpacked in Europe, and I had read Holliday's first book called The Great Orm. That's O-R-M, which is just an ancient word for worm of Loch Ness, and I was looking at the water to see if I could see anything, but I was also kind of looking over my shoulder just in case one of these things decided to cross the road.
Right. Yeah, that is just wild, and there are, one of my interests that I really have is this sort of anomalous stuff in our history that maybe shows that humans are older and stuff like that, sort of like Michael Cremo, Forbidden Archaeology, stuff like that. And it just makes me think, when it comes to all these other things, how many sort of, I guess, loosely proven specific situations are there that people are just scientifically discarding because it doesn't fit the larger narrative that we figured out, because we see this in some older stuff where they discard stuff that they can't explain. And it makes me think that there's got to be something out there. I'm a raging skeptic at the core, but the one thing I'm not skeptical about is there's definitely something out there that we don't get.
Well, most of us, I think, are rational skeptics. You need to be skeptical, and it's perfectly fine to speculate. You just don't want to be dogmatic about these things.
Absolutely.
And you and I are not cynics, and that's what you need to avoid, is the cynicism that people like Philip Klass. I don't know if you remember who he was.
No, I don't.
But he was a big-time UFO debunker, in kind of the nemesis of Stanton Friedman back in the old days.
Yeah, okay, I think I do know this, yeah. Yeah, and, that's, I think we've talked about this before on the show, that there seems to be two ways that people get into this paranormal stuff, and one is by having an experience that pulls them in, and the other is by loving all the fiction and then asking themselves, is there something to this fiction? And I definitely am the second category. I've never actually had an experience myself. I just love the fiction so much. I want to know if there's something to it.
Well, I've had virtually nothing happen to me. I had one odd thing, but I was in junior high when the wave of sightings came over Michigan, and that's when Dr. J.L.N. Hynek said that some of them might be swamp gas. And, of course, the news media jumped on it, and all flying saucers, UFOs, were swamp gas from then on. And but it was several months later, in November, was the first major sighting of the Mothman that chased two couples down Route 62 north of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And I was pretty much a goner by that time.
Yeah, that's Kara's favorite. It's Kara's. She's the Mothman fan.
I'm into Mothman. Yeah,
You need to go to the Mothman Festival every third weekend in September, and I usually speak there. You did. I did. I do one of the TNT tour hay rides where you have a guaranteed flyover of the Mothman. So it's a lot of fun. Good speakers. All the history and the geography is really fascinating there in Point Pleasant, right along the banks of the Ohio River.
Yeah, well, that sounds like an awesome good time.
I'd be into it.
Okay, so we're not too far from the end of the show here. So, where can people find out more about you? Where can they see more of you?
I'm on Facebook. Just type in Steve Ward, and if you might want to type in Battle Creek as well, because that'll kind of narrow it down. You can find me easier. I can also be heard weekly as a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files on the Distant Thunder Radio Network. And occasionally, this will be my last speaking engagement, probably through the winter. But I'm sure I'll get another offer somewhere, and so who knows? Maybe you'll run into me somewhere at a convention.
Well, you have definitely been a new topic for us, and
illuminating presence.
Right? Yeah, and it's funny because Kara and I were talking about this during the break. It's like you were talking, and then you'd pause to politely give me a chance to talk. And all of us, and the only thing I could think as my question is, and then what happened? It's like, it's not very good interview or question, I guess. But I'm just all, and then what happened?
barely scratched the surface of this. And
Yeah.
I would love to come back sometime and tell you some more.
I would love to, digging into some of those cryptids, digging into any old topic. You have been a lot of fun to have, a lot of fun to talk to, and we really appreciate you being on the show.
Well, I appreciate you having me and inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
All right. You've been listening to Steve Ward. We've been talking about From Folklore to Flying Saucers, Unexpected Connections in the Paranormal. Check him out online. Check us out online because you have been listening to Radio Wasteland.